I'm thrilled today that we have Dr. Maggie Sibley joining us to do the presentation. Dr. Sibley is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Washington School of Medicine, and her work focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of adolescents and adults with ADHD, as well as being an expert in running a group related to motivational interviewing. And some of you should remember that. Dr. Andy Fry talked about motivational interviewing, and he and Maggie have done some work together in that area as well. Dr. Sibley is incredibly productive and impactful researcher and a wonderful person. So you're in for a great experience. She's going to present some of her work, as we always do in the first half of this. And then there'll be time for questions. And remember, be preparing your questions now to ask when she's done with her presentation. They can be on anything from the content of the talk to why she chose to study this topic, to what she would do if she was starting her career over, and what would she do differently, what has she learned, all those kinds of things that you may be interested in. So without any further introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Maggie. Thank you again, Maggie.
Thank you, Steve. I'm really happy to be here, everyone. I am only here because Steve saw promise in me as a 22-year-old. So I have to give that, gratitude right up front. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So as you're watching my presentation, and because I know this is a really training focused forum, you can think about what questions I might be able to help you with related or compared to other people. So I'm in a school of medicine, even though I'm a psychologist. I'm a researcher who has been in a school of medicine since I got my first faculty job, and I graduated from my PhD program in 2012. So I'm kind of about 12 years, I guess, out of my degree now. So that you can think a little bit about how someone in that position might have certain answers to certain questions, but maybe not answers to other questions that you all might have. I'm a researcher 90% of my time. And 10% of my time I do clinical work at the hospital here in Seattle. So I still have that clinical deployment work with families, but most of the time I'm spent on grants either funded by the National Institute of Mental Health or through the U.S. Department of Education for the most part. And I collaborate with people who are way more senior than me in some ways. And then I also collaborate with people who are way more junior than me in other ways. And I really enjoy the kind of benefits you get from both of those scenarios, as well as colleagues that are kind of around my level. So I also would love to talk to you all about, collaboration as a part of this, as I think that's something that, has been important to me in my career. So let me get started. Today, I'm going to be presenting on one of the most collaborative things I'm a part of, which is a study that some of you all may have learned about in your psychology coursework called the Multimodal Treatment of ADHD study. So this was a study conducted in the 90s. The kids in this study they're a few years younger than me, so they're probably approaching 40, right? And they got followed up from the time they were 8 years old until they were about 25, 26, 27. And so one of the things that I've been a part of, although I was way too young to be, collecting this data when it was happening, later on I started collaborating with the senior authors on this research team that most of them, I would say most of them are kind of at least half retired now, but they've sort of brought on this younger group of people who are interested in continuing to mine sort of the big rich trove of data that came out of this study that couldn't possibly have been analyzed in the initial funding period, just because there was just so much of it. So a little context for what you all will be learning about today. And I will hold questions to the end and try to keep my presentation to about 25 minutes. So we have lots of time to chat afterwards, 25 to 30 maybe. All right, so let me share my screen. And let me get that on full screen. All right, if anyone has any trouble with the video or the audio, just let me know. And we're going to start with this presentation. So ADHD is my area of specialty, and we've known for probably 20 or 30 years that ADHD really should be viewed as a lifespan disorder, which means that In some individuals, it can manifest as early childhood. And it's certainly very well characterized in the elementary school aged years. That's the age where we first sort of recognized this diagnosis, really about 50 years ago. And over the last several decades, as children with ADHD were followed into adulthood, it became clear that for many folks, they're still struggling with the same symptom cluster as they get into adolescence and into young adulthood. And as they grow up and have kids of their own, we see that there's sort of a family component of ADHD. And so a lot of interest has really gone into understanding how ADHD changes across the lifespan, right? And what is it like as a disorder that could be characterized as early as young children and as late as older adults. Now, for those of you all who want a quick refresher, the symptoms of ADHD are listed in the DSM-5, and there's 5 criteria for ADHD, the A through the E criteria. And everyone's sort of familiar with the A criteria because if you've ever taken a symptom checklist of do I have ADHD or not, you're basically checking off these 18 symptoms, and you have to have a certain number of them depending on your age to be in the running for having an ADHD diagnosis. But after you see if you have enough symptoms, there's other parts of this diagnosis that are really important, which is we think of it as sort of a chronic disorder. And so we do want to see traces of it back to childhood, not something that spontaneously started with adulthood. We want to see that the symptoms are pervasive, which means they're not just really limited to a stressful job or a really difficult classroom that a person's in, but that they're really pervading other areas of their life, and sort of it's a pattern right across different domains. Really importantly, because ADHD symptoms are a trait that can be either very low or very high, depending on who you are, we have to make sure that the symptoms are clinically meaningful, which means there's reason to treat them medically. There's reason to treat them psychologically. You want to be able to actually think that there's problems in the person's life that are caused because of the level of this trait, which we call impairment. And then finally, the symptoms of ADHD are pretty generic, right? Difficulty with memory, difficulty concentrating. And so as part of making sure someone has ADHD, we have to make sure that the symptoms they're having are not better explained by another reason, right? We want to make sure it really fits that conceptualization of a disorder that's been there across the lifespan, or at least traces of it have been, that's stable in the person overall. And so this is what we look at when we diagnose ADHD. Now, in terms of that first question about ADHD across the lifespan, starting in the 90s, we got studies that were being released that were establishing whether or not there was persistence of childhood ADHD into adulthood. And there's a lot of longitudinal studies that all sort of started around the same time in the 80s and 90s with the kids, and then followed them up, into the 90s, into the 2000s, 10, 20 years to really understand what that looks like over time and if people stay with their ADHD diagnosis. So we have a pretty good sense of that literature, and I'll show you a slide on that. But really, in this particular study today, my team wanted to look at the other side of the coin, which is what about people who don't meet criteria for ADHD anymore? What is that experience like for them? Is that a true recovery experience, or is that maybe an experience where you technically don't meet criteria for ADHD, but you still really look, and talk and walk like you have the disorder? So we got interested in that. Before I did this MTA paper that I'm going to show you all today, I worked with 2 of my colleagues, collaborators that are pretty much around the same developmental level with me career-wise, Stephen Becker and John Mitchell. And we were really interested in reviewing a literature that hadn't really been reviewed, which was all of those longitudinal studies I just mentioned to you all, and whether or not there was a consistent sort of rate of ADHD persistence into adulthood among children diagnosed with ADHD. So we gathered all the studies in the literature. We published this in the Lancet Psychiatry in 2016, and we found pretty interestingly that there were a really big variation in allegedly what percentage of kids with ADHD still had it as adults. And so what we found in this study was if you just took what their findings at face value, it could range from 5% of people still had it as an adult to almost 80%. And that just is too wide of a range to make sense to us, right? We got to narrow that somehow. We wouldn't expect every sample to have the same answer, but that is just really wide. So we started looking at like the differences in how they defined and diagnosed ADHD. Remember my slide with the A through E criteria. So we started looking at that, and sort of if we held some of that constant, do we get like a little narrower range? And as we worked through those papers and tried to hold some things constant, we did find this narrower range that was sort of like about 40 to 50%, depending on who you're looking at, seemed to meet DSM criteria for ADHD as an adult if they were diagnosed in childhood. So this is great. Maybe this is stable, maybe it's not, but from what we were able to conclude, we have a sense of who's still meeting criteria, at least, a range of a sense. But it didn't feel like the full story. And then, so we got interested in some other sub questions underneath this. What does it mean to not have ADHD anymore, technically? Does it mean you have no symptoms or just lower symptoms? Does it mean you might have symptoms still, but you're just not impaired by those symptoms or impaired as much? What if someone's just really on a good regimen of medication and has good supports around them and they're doing well? Does that count as being recovered from ADHD, or does that count as just being treated successfully? What about if this distinction that's in the DSM but isn't really explained in the DSM about full remission from ADHD versus partial? So what does that even mean? Is there a definition? Can we draw a line between someone who's fully recovered, fully remitted, and someone who's partially? So I thought it was surprising that I guess we started this work probably in 2018 or 19, around that time, that really we hadn't, a lot of these questions were pretty unanswered. So the only study that really tackled some of this head on was the late Dr. Biederman's team in Mass General Hospital. Obviously, you see the dates on these studies, so it was done a while ago. But they were able to sort of parse out, of these people who technically no longer met DSM criteria for ADHD, how many really look like they didn't have ADHD anymore. And in their sample, they had a boy sample and a girl sample with separate papers. They found that about 2/3 of children with ADHD no longer met criteria technically. But if you looked closely, about 22 to 23% really looked like they were pretty clean from ADHD, low symptoms, low impairments, completed treatment. So that's interesting, right? And so we learned from that who's remitted depends on the definition you use. Important for researchers. But the limitation of that Biederman study is that they only looked at adulthood in one time point. At one point in adulthood, and they closed the book on it, right? And we said, well, how do we know that just because you're remitted at 1 year of adulthood means that you are still remitted 3 years later, for example? No one's looked at that. We don't know the answer to that question. So we thought that the MTA data could help us with that. So we wanted to know, is remission stable? Like if you are, judged to have overcome ADHD, is that a permanent status? So that's one of the kind of big questions that led to the current study. So in this study that I'm going to be showing you all, we had a few goals. First of all, the conclusions you draw in your research study are only as good as the measurement tools that you're using, to define things. And I think we give a lot of measurement tools a pass that are like not the best because everyone's using them, but we felt like this is a really important research question, and we really need to make sure that we feel good about what we're doing. So we actually took the time to revisit this remission definition and how we would actually like operationalize it, essentially. So we started by just trying to figure out, what does full remission mean and what's a definition we feel like we can stand on. The MTA study has 8 longitudinal follow-up time points starting, there was an acute treatment phase of the study where kids got randomized to either get medication or behavioral treatment or both or nothing. But then about 3 years later into the following the kids, all those treatments, although they originally was separated in some ways, which is not about not like the topic of this talk. What you need to know is they all came back together again by 3 years, and no one was doing any better than anyone else, regardless of the treatment they got. And so at that point, the MTA group just started following them every couple of years until they were basically till they didn't get funded anymore when the kids were in their late 20s, to just see how life was going for these folks. So that led to 8 longitudinal data points about every 2 years apart. And so we were able to look both. If we had just taken the snapshot each year, would we find the same answer across those years? But we also could string those years together like a string of pearls, right? And sort of look at them in relationship to each other and see kind of what was the trend over time for people who seem to be getting better or not. So this is pretty cool data that we were able to tap into and ask some interesting questions. Now, I just mentioned to you all a little bit about the MTA design, but just so you feel fully like looped in, they got 14 months of treatment as children when they were around 8. They were either medication or psychosocial or both or neither. There was 579 children with ADHD in the sample. They all had combined type ADHD. That's important. There were classmates without ADHD who 2 years into the study were recruited. Well, actually, most of them didn't have ADHD. There were a few that did. They're often taken out. But this group is a reference group for, are the kids with ADHD looking like their peers without ADHD, essentially. And so then we followed them from 16 years after baseline. And this is what I was saying before. You can see across the years of the study on the x-axis at the bottom, 0 to 16 years of follow-up. Initially, with the treatment, there was some separation of the groups based on different things possibly being more effective than one another. But as you can see, they all converged back together later. And so we don't, when we analyze the MTA data in the adult phase, for example, we don't really spend a lot of time talking about the treatment impact that, because we over and over again in this data set, we see that the treatment didn't matter anymore once you were 3 years out. So in this particular study that I'm going to show you some data on now, it's 95% of the original MTA 579 kids, so it's 558. On average, these kids completed at least 6 follow-up assessments of the 8. What we see in the MTA, it's not like they all dropped out after 6 and never came back. It's sort of Swiss cheese-like. So sometimes people missed a year for this reason or that, but we tend to still have, as you see, the average age at everyone's last time point was 25 years old, and that was the target end age for the sample. So we do have pretty full data, just people are sometimes missing a time point here or there. Why this sample is good for this research question is that we asked really detailed ADHD measures to people if they had ADHD or not in the sample every couple of years. So we had your standard symptom checklist filled out by parents, teachers, and kids. As they got older, they were no longer kids, but and we had impairment ratings on rating scales. Started with just parent filling that out, added the self-report when they were teenagers. That gives us sort of a domain-specific impairment scores for kids. They got really long interviews about every form of treatment they were using and how much they were using it. That started out with the parents being interviewed and eventually integrated the self-report as they got to be adults. And then they got a full clinical interview of all DSM disorders that they got every time they came in to see what other comorbidities or possible alternative diagnoses the kids had. So with this information, we can put together a pretty good picture of people's lives retrospectively. It's almost, we didn't make these remission classifications what the person in front of us. We went back and looked at what we had on them, and then they made the classifications. We did some fancy statistics that we got help with from our statistical consultants on this study. The measurement work, which is probably what you're least interested in, so I won't go super deep on it, but you can read the paper if you're interested. The measurement work helped us figure out what definition of full remission, right, being truly recovered from ADHD was associated with no longer having impairment or problems in your life. That was one thing we wanted to sort of put that against. And then we also wanted to know what definition of remission made you look like a non-ADHD person in the sample? So we were kind of making sure you didn't have problems because of your ADHD symptoms, and that we weren't being so strict, right, that you had to have absolutely nothing wrong with you. And turns out most of these non-ADHD folks have a symptom or two of ADHD, right? And that's something that's important to know about ADHD. So in the end, when we looked at this, we were able to sort of say, if you have 3 or fewer symptoms of ADHD and negligible, which is like a 0 or a 1 on a 6-point impairment scale related to ADHD impairment, and you are no longer taking any medication or treatment, psychological behavioral treatments for ADHD, we felt pretty comfortable that you could be called fully remitted. So we validated that with some statistical analyses. Then we pulled together clinicians on the study. So these are psychiatrists and psychologists. You can see them here. I think you guys have one of your, for those of you, if any of you are affiliated with Ohio State, you have Jean Arnold here, who's one of your kind of emeritus people who was among this group. And basically, we looked at everyone that had comorbidities in addition to ADHD to see, you know, if they're impaired, but they don't have ADHD symptoms, what does that impairment due to? Is it due to one of these comorbidities, or is it due to like residual ADHD symptoms? Conceivably, you could have 2 symptoms of ADHD, but if they're the most 2 impairing symptoms in the world, like, you know, then you probably are not fully remitted from ADHD. If you're the most forgetful person in the world, but you've got everything else under control, but that forgetfulness is causing you all kinds of problems, you know, arguably we wouldn't want to call you fully remitted. So there's a lot of debate in these, and we used lots of people to make voting decisions so we could do the best we could to make things that felt solid to us. Okay, so this was the hardest part of the study, basically digging into the weeds on these interesting people who sort of like looked like they were kind of confusing about whether they still had ADHD or not. And these were some of the rules here on this slide that we used to kind of sort out who we were going to say had ADHD still and who didn't when there was a comorbidity involved. So what are the results of this study? So here you can see on the y-axis the different years of the study. So how many years after baseline? It goes all the way to 16. You can see how many people came into the assessment that particular year. Like I mentioned, they're kind of different people sometimes in different years. And you can see the age that they were at these different time points. And if you go all the way to the right, you can see the persistent percentage. So remember that review John Mitchell and Stephen Becker and I did in 2016. You could see that here we go. We kind of like replicated what all the studies were finding, right? Which is like 40 to 50% of people still have ADHD when they're followed up with basically as adolescents, adults. So that's pretty much something that is consistent with everyone else's finding. But what's interesting, if you go to the next column, the partial remission column in the middle, again, here we're kind of replicating Biederman's work, which is showing that most people who considered remitted, means they technically don't meet DSM criteria for ADHD anymore. Those folks, most of them are actually partially remitted, not fully remitted. So they technically don't meet the criteria, but they're still having some problems or they're still treated for their ADHD. And then we see on the very left, the full remission. So these are people who look really clean. And you can see that that number goes up a little bit as you go from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And so that's interesting. You've got in any given year, right? You have between, let's say in adolescence, you've kind of got between like, I don't know, around 5% of people who look like this. And by adulthood, 15-ish, kind of encroaching on 20. So that's interesting. But let's talk about what that really looked like if you zoomed out. So everyone in this sample had ADHD in childhood. That was a requirement of being in the ADHD group, the 579. What we found is that 31% of this sample of these 579 kids met criteria for full remission from ADHD at least one assessment. So sometime in those 8 time points, they looked that clean. When you ask their parents, when you ask their teachers, when you ask themselves. So we're asking across people. It's not just one person's opinion. And we look at everything else going on in their life. 30% at least had a really good year, right? That's what this tells us. And then what we learned was that, but only 9% of the sample, so only like a third of those people who remitted once, continued to be remitted for the rest of the study. So that's interesting too, right? Because it means, wait a sec, so there are people who are doing better, but then they don't stay there. most of the time, 2 out of 3 times, they don't stay better, at least according to the measures, that we collected. So that's the new part of this study, that people hadn't really no one had just run those analyses really on any of these data sets before. And that was interesting and a lot to chew on, I think. So what this looks like is, if you, again, string those pearls together and look at people over time and what they're doing, actually, it turns out that only orange, 10% of this sample had ADHD in childhood and kept that ADHD criteria the whole time, all the way to age 25, every 2 years. So that was only 10% that were really stably always, at that high clinical level for their ADHD. We only had 9%, as I showed you on the last slide, that got better and stayed better. So when people talk about, oh, ADHD, does it persist or not? They're usually thinking about the orange and the blue. Do you still have it, or do you not have it, right? And they think about it so black and white like that. But what we found out was that most people aren't either of those things. They're either the yellow or the green. So the yellow is people who got a little better, right? They're partially remitted, and they stayed sort of in that subclinical zone. They didn't get back up to the high symptom and impairment, but they also didn't get all the way better. And the biggest group was people who, depending on the year, were in a different status, and they fluctuated. So these folks would have changed at least twice across that 8 years. They were originally at ADHD, then they remitted, and then they went back to ADHD. And that's 64% of the MTA sample. So that's interesting. Remember, these kids all have ADHD combined type, so we have to replicate this in inattentive type people, but still interesting. Here's another way of looking at it on another picture. The bars are each year. Remember that first table I showed you of what percentage of people either have ADHD, black, gray, partial remission, or white remission, right? So you can see each year that's a pretty stable, the remission goes up a little bit over time in the white, but it's kind of stable with the black and the gray. But you can see that if you look at people dropping out of one of those pie chart colors, that changes over time. And so you have like the stable persistence as you get older. Less and less people have held on to their ADHD diagnosis every year, right? The more time points you have, the more opportunities you have to lose it. So we would expect that. And then the yellow and the green, which are people getting better, more and more people sort of get better and stay better. Again, it's a little biased because the less you have left, the more opportunity you have to stay better, but it's interesting still. And then the blue is what percentage of the sample, already meets fluctuating status, and that stays the same pretty much over development. So it's pretty interesting. And I just want to show you, to wrap up here, like what does a person look like? Let's talk about an individual person, right? So here's somebody a real case in the MTA study that met the fluctuating pattern and what they look like. I'm definitely showing you one that really illustrates this. They weren't all this beautiful, but just full disclosure, but to share the idea, right? The black lines are inattentive symptom severity. The red lines are hyperactive impulsive. The bold one is if you counted a symptom that was present by anyone reporting. And then the individual dotted ones, are different raters. So the parent, the teacher, the self, right? So if you just look at the bold lines, you get the big picture. There are people who were high in childhood. This person then at age 14, they were doing a lot better according to everyone. They didn't have any impairment and they weren't being treated at that time point. 16, almost 18, they're back up. They've gotten higher according to everyone. The self's up there, the teacher's up there. And then they have another good period around 19 where they're doing better. And then again, this person, 21, almost 22 years old, they're back up again. So, we have more work to do on why. The why is what we're working on now, but it's pretty interesting. And then people will ask, well, what is the average, look of a fluctuating person? So there's a paper that just got accepted that really goes into this, but just I'll show you a little slide on this. The mean low point of people, the 64% in that fluctuating group, was 2 symptoms of inattention and, trough. 2 symptoms of inattention, and the high point was 8 symptoms of inattention. The mean low point of hyperactivity impulsivity, about 1 symptom. The mean high point, almost 7. Most people were more likely to carry their impairment than carry their symptoms when they fluctuated. So a lot of those people who went into partial remission, low symptoms, still had impairment. And most people in the fluctuating group had at least 3 fluctuations. They went up, they went down, they went up, they went back down across 9 assessments, which is the 8 follow-ups plus baseline. And then on average, how long did they stay in a status? To us, it looks like about 4.7 years. We only did them every 2 years, so we don't know what happened in between those 2 years, but that's what it's looking like in our data set. This is a person who would have recovered. So again, you can see they were, symptomatic, impaired all the way through age 18, get to young adulthood by both parent and self-report. Symptoms stay down, impairment stays down, not being treated. Okay, so just to wrap up, I have to disclose the limitations here, right? We stopped following people up around age 25. We really need to find out what happens after that time point. There's one Brazilian study that looked at them in middle adulthood and is still finding fluctuations. So that's interesting. Only combined type people in this sample, not inattentive. I told you about the missing data up front. Hopefully I did all of this up front. Let's see if I did. 6 out of 8 time points for people. When people got to adulthood, we didn't collect teacher ratings anymore. Lots of people in the sample were not in school at all. And some were in school, but it's pretty hard to figure out how to get college teachers to give good detailed information. We could have defined our remission differently, that early measurement work. We could have, said people are remitted based on like how much better they get from where they started, instead of saying you have to be like, this low at a certain magnitude. There's pros and cons to those 2 approaches. Also, we were strict on ourselves. If self-report said that they were fully remitted, we required an informant to agree with them. So if there was there were some cases where like in adulthood, the parent wasn't reachable. And so we only had self-report, and we just treated that like a missing data point. So that is important to know, because we may have underestimated remission, if anything. But we do know that self-report in this sample, self-report tends to be way lower than informant report, both for parents and teachers at any age. And so we're making that assumption to try to keep our data as accurate as possible, given its limitations. And we also have to do way more complex analyses to understand relationships between treatment and remission. That wasn't the scope of this paper. So that's the end of this presentation. I mean, I think here's your take-home points. When people are considered to be remitted or desistant from ADHD, usually that means they're just a little better. It doesn't mean they're fully recovered. That's usually what that means in the literature and clinical settings. It's pretty rare to, at least by young adulthood, to have fully recovered from ADHD. Most people who, 50% won't meet criteria for ADHD in any given year. But either they're still sub-threshold and experiencing a lot of impairments, or next time you see them, they're going to have it again. So it's not really accurate to say 50% of people recover from ADHD as adults. And it brings up some interesting questions about sort of like the phenomenon of ADHD. It seems like it fluctuates a little bit. This shouldn't scare or surprise us. Things like hypertension do that. Obesity does that, right? These chronic health disorders that ADHD sort of is kind of like similar to in some ways. But within the disorder, you're gonna have years where things are worse and things are better, right? And because we've kind of created this arbitrary cut point, sometimes your better years are gonna pop you down below it, and sometimes your worst years are gonna pop you above it. And while we do have this 10% of people who are just sort of always so severe, they're always above that threshold. With a disorder like ADHD, where we've kind of created this sort of subjective line between who has it and who doesn't, one result of defining a disorder that way is there's going to be instability around that line. And so what we are working on now in the MTA, and I know other people are too, is trying to understand, like, what are some of the determinants of good years versus bad years to help potentially leverage this for public health initiatives, for treatments, for just things people with ADHD can do to help themselves out, right? And so that's sort of like one of our future directions as a group here. So that's it. I'm going to stop there. And I hope that was the right amount of time that I took on that. And I hope that, it was at least a little bit interesting to you guys. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maggie. That was great. We're going to do like we've done on the other talks. Use the little raise hand button if you have a question, and I'll just call on people. But I'm going to ask the first question, and I want to double check. I think this is probably implied, but I didn't recall you saying it definitively. People were considered they were all combined type at the beginning, but as you followed them, they were considered to still have ADHD present if they were inattentive type
Correct.
as well, right? Okay. Just wanted to
Correct.
double
Yeah.
check with that.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for mentioning that. That could be confusing. Yeah, so they just had to meet DSM-5 criteria for ADHD at any subtype. We did use 5 even retrospectively to make it current because adults, or not adults, 17 years old and older only need 5 symptoms to have DSM-5 ADHD diagnosis. In the DSM-4 it was 6 symptoms, so it actually got a little bit easier to get adult ADHD diagnosis. So we're applying that criteria in any subtype, but not the unspecified or the ADHD NOS, which are sort of the those are kind of flexible diagnoses.
Thanks, Maggie. Emily?
Yeah, related to that question, did you see that when, I guess they're not kids, but when participants came for follow-up, that it was primarily like inattentive or more so inattentive symptoms that were spiking than hyperactivity, or was it balanced, or what did that look like?
What I remember without having like raw data in front of me is basically we do see the hyperactive impulsive decline over time in the sample, as it usually does. And I will tell you the reason for that is some people could argue that it's because people are becoming less hyperactive and impulsive, but probably a big part of it is that the questions about hyperactivity, impulsivity are about the childlike manifestations of that. So I don't really know if they're actually less hyper and impulsive, but what we see is that the inattentive symptoms are more likely to be at higher levels as people get older. And so, yeah, if somebody, most of the fluctuation that's probably going above the threshold is probably happening on the inattentive dimension, just because you saw that the trough and the peak of that was a little wider on the inattention. Yeah.
So Maggie,
Grace?
I have, oh, sorry.
Oh. Grace, go ahead.
I had a question on actually like collaboration, going to what you mentioned before your talk. So like when you're starting out in your research, and I guess even now, like when you're collaborating with people who are your senior, like how do you navigate knowing that they have like a lot more experience than you and you have a lot to learn, or like you can learn a lot from them, but still being confident in what you have to contribute?
That's a really good question. I think you have to really be thoughtful about who you collaborate with, because I do think there are like senior folks out there, and I am so fortunate that I stumbled into, that like some of these folks on the MTA study early on. I think it was some luck that those folks are so interested in letting me do what I do and just supporting me and like building me up. And I mean, this group has so many years of mentorship. They're great communicators because they had to deal with a lot of infighting early on. So now they all know how to work, together. And I think you have to be confident in yourself. Like, none of us are perfect, especially when we're junior and not sure yet. Do as much as you can do on your own, and then identify where you do need support and try to just ask for the support where you identify that like you need it, instead of just not trusting and asking for too much across the board. You know what I mean? Like, be confident in what you know and then go to them with what you don't. And also work hard, because if they see you're working really hard on things, they're gonna give you more, or you're basically going to task shift to them only the part of mentorship that they need to give you, and you're going to do the rest for yourself. And then they'll be very generous with what you do need, because they see that you're not relying on them for little things that you could teach yourself, essentially. I think that's the big thing. I try to teach myself everything I can, but then recognize where I need to get help.
Thank you. Allie?
Hi, I had a more like career question, or I guess kind of 2 questions that are related. So I know that you mentioned that you do majority of research and then a little bit of practice in hospital settings. And so I was wondering first, like how either in grad school or after, like you came to the decision that that's what you wanted your career to look like. And then secondly, how you either found or pursued a career where you can kind of have that balance where you do majority research, but also some practice in the hospital setting.
Yeah, I think when I went to grad school initially, like I sort of just like went in with this idea that I'm doing mental health and psychology because I want to help people. And you're told in like college that, okay, well then usually that means you turn into like a psychologist that like, delivers treatment and that's your job. But then when I was forced to get a research background in order to get into a PhD program, I actually sort of realized like, oh wait, like I like both of these things, but honestly, what I'm better at is sort of like the research side of it. And so I sort of just saw that that was like where I could contribute more to the field. And so I was like all in on it at that point. And then and I do like research on treatment, so I still can get that treatment part that I love, but I think I have more to offer in research probably than there's just the therapists I work with are brilliant and they're so creative and I feel like I don't hold a candle to them. So and then beyond that, like if you go into a medical school for a job as a PhD, you often do have a split of clinical and research, but the distribution of that split depends on a lot of different things. And the most important thing is the being able to secure your own funding. I'm not on a soft money line. I'm on a hard money line where I am, which means that I don't need to have grant funding to have a job. But if I don't have grant funding, I become 100% of a clinical psychologist at the hospital treating patients. So I'm fine with that worst case scenario. It doesn't put me out of a job. It just means I don't get to do what I love as much. But so like looking for a setup like that is really good because the onus is on you to get grants and get yourself as much research funding as you can. But if you don't, like, there's no stress that you're going to lose your job or be fired, right? And because they need lots of clinicians too. So I like that setup.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie?
Sure, I'm going to swing it back to your data for a minute. So a clinical question. So when I think we're sitting in front of a parent of an elementary kid who we're trying to decide the first time diagnosis, and then I think about your data with all this variability, on one hand, I wish our science was better, right? I wish we could say with more confidence what's going to happen to their child. And on one hand, we could say, well, the diagnosis is not as important as the treatment. Let's get your child supports for their impairment. But the reality is the diagnosis does matter for very important things in people's perspectives. So I just wonder what your thoughts are, like how we help make that decision when you're at a kid who's right on the cusp of 5 or 6 symptoms and he's a mild case. And I just love to hear your thoughts of like, how does this stream of data and science now inform kind of that initial diagnostic question, if at all?
Yeah, so there's unspecified ADHD and otherwise specified ADHD, which are dangerous categories because they don't have definitions. But yet, if I was going to use them, I might use them on the kid who is a couple symptoms short, but clearly impaired. And then monitoring becomes really important, and saying to the family up front, like, I think it's really important for people to know that ADHD is on a continuum, that the average person has 2 or 3 symptoms of ADHD. There's multiple samples showing that. So if you have 4 or 5, you're definitely elevated and you've got some issues in that area. But I think you're tiptoeing around that diagnostic threshold. You can still get kids treatment and care with the unspecified or the otherwise specified ADHD code. So that's something, right? But you're also sort of not sure if they're just in a really stressful period of their life and that's actually their high point, and then they'll go back down and be fine. If you're not sure, then I think you just keep monitoring, come back in 6 months. Let's see how you're doing. You can pretty much get almost everything with those sort of sub-threshold codes without inflating the percentage of people in this country who have ADHD by, giving it to anyone who's like, some people that I'm colleagues with would argue if you're having trouble because of a symptom cluster and the clear solution to the symptom cluster is like a medication, a stimulant medication, then you have ADHD. And I think that's a defensible argument, but at the same time, I think the downside of that argument is 30% of the population could technically then suddenly have a diagnosis, which I don't think protects the credibility of the diagnosis over time.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Phoebe.
Yeah, I first wanted to say a really great talk. But I also wanted to go back. I was really interested in the part of the talk where you were talking about people who like meet the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis 1 year and then like not like that kind of fluctuation, the gray area, because I feel like a lot of times when we think about diagnosis, we tend to think about it as a black and white thing, and it's definitely not. And that's one reason why I find this so interesting. But I was wondering if in addition to what you said in the talk, if you like know of any research or have any theories on like kind of why that fluctuation happens, and if it could be tied to like, I know that there's like a discussion around like a genetic component for ADHD, and I didn't know if like there were patterns in different populations, like in some populations you see more of that fluctuation than in others. I don't know.
Yeah, good question. Okay. Yeah. So Philip Shaw at NIH is doing that study right now where he's looking at genetic associations with if people are fluctuating or stable presentations of ADHD. He has shared with me what he found, but I don't think I have permission to tell you what it is. But I will say that I think we're headed in the direction of learning a little bit about that on the genetic level specifically. There's also, I'm going to tell you what I remember, which might need to be double checked, but I believe there's also some studies, maybe someone in here knows about them, that show that people who have ADHD symptoms that seem to be cross-situational versus dependent on situations is associated with certain genetic markers, which is sort of like relevant here. So basically, if your ADHD is so stable that it's not sensitive to the environment that you're in, that may be one, like at least phenotype, maybe genotype. But if your ADHD sort of like can be brought into check by the situation you're in, a classroom with good classroom management, for example, that may be different. And so that's kind of an interesting potential linked area here on the genetic side. But to answer your question directly, we did have this paper that got accepted. So I guess I can talk about it now, that follows up from this. And what we found is that the fluctuating presentation appears to be associated with a standard moderate course of ADHD, the average person, at least combined typed. The people who have the very sort of stable ADHD appear to have higher family psychopathology, higher comorbidities in childhood and adolescent, higher risk for substance use. So that seems to be a kind of like a polypsychiatric situation, and then we also have the people who recovered seem to have some protective factors in place, in fact, in childhood. So it seems like protective factors may help you overcome lots of unfortunate risk and adversity factors may keep you stable, but most people are kind of, at least in the MTA sample, in that middle group. And we did find that there's a correlation that you cannot infer causation from over time using multi-level models across 8 time points. So that's fairly good, showing that the higher the environmental demands, the more likely you are to be remitted, which is maybe the opposite of what people were thinking. But if you think about it, it's kind of interesting because it shows that like when people are doing better, they're also capable of taking on more. So I think that's kind of an interesting clinical message there that like, we don't know what's triggering spikes, but it seems like people with ADHD, and you can tell them clinically, even a child, like if we can get your symptoms and impairments under control, you're capable of living a pretty successful life. But you have to be kind of on the lookout at any time, like circumstances can come that can maybe like exacerbate that for you. And you really have to clinically learn how to know yourself well enough that you can recognize what you need in order to stay in that good place. And I think that's a message that you can give someone without having very specific data to back it up and have it still be pretty true. So.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I find the intersection between psychology and like genetics and biology very interesting. So.
You should do work in that area. It's so needed. Like the genetics revolution could unlock so many things for us. I think that's cool.
Thanks, Phoebe. Eric? You're muted.
Wow. Bottom line up front. Would you like to collaborate?
The answer is always yes.
Did you read the chat while you were talking?
No, I couldn't. I multitask that well. I'm better.
Yeah, I can't either. So you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in the chat where I'm like, I've had very similar conversations about mood disorders. Mood disorders also are episodic, so that's kind of hard. And then I'm like, in fact, we've been talking about this with lambs,
Yeah.
with Gene Arnold, and then OMG, that's Gene Arnold. And then you gave him a shout out. And do you already know Anna Van Meter?
She wrote, yeah, because we wrote, I'm like the second author, I think, on the Lambs paper on that replicated this.
Right. So I was, at one point I was visibly laughing at myself. I'm like, I knew that your name was familiar. Now I know why.
Yeah, because we're on a publication together, right? You're on that.
Right.
That's it. Yeah.
So do you run your own stats?
I run my own stats when I am in my wheelhouse, but I also work with other people to make sure I don't overstep my competence.
Yeah, me too, mostly. The only, yeah, so many things to talk about. Do you want to would it be okay if I put your name forward to do grand rounds next year or so?
Yeah, happy to. I love doing grand rounds. Sounds good.
Outstanding. I'll save stuff for later, but I've read some of your work and I've had a lot of conversations about stuff that you're doing with Gene and with Anna. So like much respect.
Thank you. I love them. Gene Arnold is who I want to be when I grow up.
Me too.
Apple trees and all. So
me too.
Yeah.
What a I mean, and just like wonderful human being and ridiculously smart and very, very generative and generous.
Yeah, he's taught me a lot about, I don't know, just how to walk through this world in this research career. So that's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of gratitude.
Excellent.
For him. Cool.
Enough
Thanks.
for now.
Caitlin?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway.
Hey, I really enjoyed your talk as well. And just was curious about whether you found like specific developmental points at which fluctuations were higher or lower when looking at like ADHD symptoms, if that makes sense. Like the example case you showed seemed to maybe correlate with like big like transitions potentially with like the high school years and going into college. And I just didn't know if that was consistent.
Yeah, let me look at that on that slide. Hold on, I got it. So there is one place that there's a blip that we can't say for sure what it is. Okay, so I'm looking at the slide, but I'm not sharing it with you all. But so there is at 16 years, which is like they're at 25, you had less people remitted than from looks like age 18 to age 23 by like 4%, which is probably meaningful, but we didn't run a statistical significance test. And I think that's interesting in terms of like, is that when you sort of launch into the part of adulthood where you really have to sort of start getting it together age 25, and so more people are, having a higher executive function burden and experiencing symptoms again, or possibly is self-report at that point becoming more insightful? Russ Barkley's work suggests a little bit that as you get older, your self-report gets a little more insightful. So that would be interesting to look into. From age 16.8 to age 18.7, which pretty much is probably a solid in between there. Most people finished high school. The remissions from 6% to 18, which is a big jump. Now, part of that is due to loss of teacher ratings for sure. But along with that loss of teacher ratings is for many kids the loss of being in school. And so when they're no longer in school, they're also not asked to do all these executive function tasks all the time. And so there may be that's what we were trying to find in that demands analysis that we didn't find it. But there may be this relationship where and you have to think about this. There's a lot of corners of this thought, but like, the more you have to do, the more your symptoms are obvious, therefore reported, therefore you meet criteria for ADHD. So I do think there's more to look into with this idea of environmental features bringing out or making obvious symptoms that, is possibly that transition from high school to college, or for those who didn't go to college, if they go into the military or they go into like firefighting or something that's a good fit for their energy level and doesn't require them to sit down and have high levels of complex executive functions, their symptoms might not come out as much, right? So it's interesting.
Thank you. Noreen, did I?
No, I didn't raise my hand. Sorry.
All right. I messed up saying your name twice already, previously Kennedy. So I thought I remembered, but apparently not.
That's okay. It's Kennedy.
Kennedy, how did I not get that right? All right,
That's
sorry.
okay, no worries. My question is, in your opinion, how do you think using other disciplines could contribute to answering the question about fluctuation within age?
Well, public health and mental health have a lot to talk to each other about. So thinking about epidemiological data, I think is the first thing that pops into my head when you say that. Epidemiological studies are so interesting because they have a lot of people in them, but they also can't do deep dives on anyone because they're low burden samples, right? They don't fill out 3-hour batteries when you're part of an epidemiological study. So we have to talk to each other, the people who look wide and broad and the people who look deep. That is a critical conversation. You cannot make a conclusion about how things are going for a certain developmental period or a certain population, in the mental health community without having public health talk to psychiatry/psychology. So that's, I think, one really important answer to your question. And I think it's sort of like, your question is great because I think it's really important for everyone to think about the fact that some research questions cannot possibly be answered by one study. It's like it's a set of moving pictures. It's a video, and our studies are all like often just a snapshot, right? And you have to put them all together on the CSI board, like look at it like a detective would and be like, if we learn this from this and this from that and this from that, how does this fit together, right? And we really do have to not be afraid sometimes to like say that like I came to this conclusion in a dialectic between empirical, science and intuition of being able to put these pieces together and say, this is why I think this. And as long as you are upfront and straightforward about like why you think what you think and where it's coming from and the limitations of, that, people can judge for themselves if they want to believe you or not. And I think that's the main thing, is just to be upfront.
Thanks, Kennedy. Emily?
I would love to hear your thoughts on this question, which is, one, you said that it was was it parent training, medication, mix of both or none, or what was the psychosocial treatment?
Oh, in the MTA's original design. So
Yes.
they got everything. They got summer treatment program, they got parent training both during the summer treatment program and booster sessions when they went back to school. They got classroom consultation with their schools to help with behavior management in the classroom. I think that's all they got. If anyone else here knows that I missed something, let me know. And then they got medication. That's the psychosocial condition, right? And then the medication, they had individually titrated medication where they tried to find the perfect medication for them. Back in the 90s, there weren't as many choices as there are today, but stimulant medications. And then and some people got both of those things.
Yeah, so I guess my thought and question is, I guess what I'm hearing from a lot of what you presented was that environment probably plays a lot into, some of these spikes or the demands needed. And when the demands are higher, then the impairment might be higher, the symptoms might be higher, or just more easily observed. Do you think that if org training was something that was done, like really emphasizing the skills needed to best manage symptoms, was like a focus of treatment and then a follow-up, would you think that the fluctuation would be any different?
This is what I can share on that. It's a hard question to answer. Some of my research that I didn't talk about is looking at teenage delivered psychosocial treatments that pretty much are centrally an organization skills treatment. They often have other things involved. 2 studies now, we have long-term effects 3-4 years later for improved organization skills in those kids, that they retain them, which is a good contrast to the MTA where they didn't find long-term effects, but they didn't look at that measure. But the effects on ADHD persistence long-term in both of those studies was null. So what I can tell you is they seem to be getting some life skills, using those life skills, but at least in our 2 samples, both of them had about 300 people, one a little less. That's not converting into ADHD status changes. So I don't know what to make of that fully, but maybe you do. But yeah, I'm not sure it's converting, but it is helping them. And they do subjectively, when you qualitatively interview them, they feel like the treatment has helped them in their life. So it's interesting. I think these things are complex.
They certainly are. Kayla.
Hi. So I have two questions. One is really minor. The fluctuating, like the data on the fluctuating ADHD. Did you say what paper that was in?
Yeah. So that's American Journal of Psychiatry. Do I have a picture of it? 2021, and it's called Variable Patterns of Remission from the ADHD in the Multimodal Treatment Study of ADHD.
Okay, perfect. And then my second question was just, I guess, an opinion question on like the idea of symptoms kind of changing into adulthood, or at least maybe the environments you're in adulthood making your symptoms present differently. I am just wondering, like, theoretically, in your opinion, what would be the best way to assess ADHD in adulthood? Like, should we have different symptoms for ADHD in adulthood, or what would you think on that? I don't know if that's too big.
Oh, this is a part of my life very heavily right now because I'm the chair of the new guidelines coming out for diagnosis of ADHD in adults. The issue is this. We have crowdsourced off the internet in Reddit threads the most interesting long list of possible new symptoms for adult ADHD that like spiked in the pandemic. Go look up Google Trends across the pandemic for the search term ADHD, and you will see what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But we have to see if those are symptoms truly unique to ADHD or symptoms of a person who's stressed. And so we don't know if they're unique to ADHD, or yes, all people with ADHD experience those things, but is that really something that's unique to ADHD? So what we need to do is, and some of you do this if you want to, we need to get all these crowdsourced symptoms, and then we need to give them to people with ADHD, without ADHD, with other psychiatric disorders that often look like ADHD, and we need to figure out what helps us with a diagnosis, because the lived experience of people with ADHD is one thing. A symptom that helps the clinician efficiently tell if someone has a disorder or not is something else. And just because everyone with ADHD experiences X, if that doesn't distinguish them from other disorders, it's not helpful in a diagnostic context. So we need to be both creative thinkers and open to the things that the lived experience community is telling us that's happening for them. But we also need to check what they say and whether it would help with a diagnosis. So yes, I do think there is room to improve the criteria, but the DSM-5 criteria have been rigorously tested. They do distinguish people, at least a lot of people, who have ADHD and who don't. So for the time being, we stick with those until that heavy measurement work has been done to like validate new symptoms. Otherwise, we're going to create a huge diagnostic mud puddle where we jump too fast into like redefining ADHD and didn't realize all the consequences of the new symptoms. And now everyone's confused about who has what. So that's my personal take. What? Somebody coughed. I don't know what happened.
Bipolar.
Yeah. There you go. Learn from your ancestors. That's the answer there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was coughing. Something stuck in my throat. But while I'm interrupting, like we're thinking so similarly about so many things. I've been watching myself vibrate during the talk, which is why it's extra hilarious that you're like, I could talk about the rock and the measurement stuff, but that's not what you want to hear. I'm like, no! That was the only time that we were different.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, this wasn't a presentation for you, Eric. It was for these lovely trainees who are coming up and want to know about definitely not the ROC curve. Yeah. I'll be happy to give you a personal presentation on their OU secret if you want.
So. That's special, Eric. You get your own presentation. That's good. Lily.
Hi, I was interested in hearing a little bit about your experiences using motivational interviewing of patients and how that's looked like in your clinical work, and then specifically when working with clients with ADHD, how that might have like unique benefits compared to like other therapeutic interventions for people with ADHD.
Yeah, so ADHD has as a part of its sort of core features difficulties with both initial motivation to pursue goals or pursue, certain behaviors that would be adaptive for people, and an executive function issue that makes it really hard for people to follow through on things, even if they really want to do those things. And so when you look at motivational interviewing, it's really set up specifically for both of those issues, cultivating initial desire and self-efficacy, which is also impaired in people with ADHD, sort of the psychological ingredients of being committed to making a change, but then also helping people maintain an initial change and follow through consistently, which is what is so hard for people with ADHD. So I think motivational interviewing is best conceptualized as an augmentation to evidence-based treatments for ADHD, not a standalone treatment, but it really can help people with especially like the home skill application of what you might be teaching them in CBT or behavior therapy. And you do have to make modifications to MI for people with ADHD. So for example, the planning phase of MI, which is the fourth of the, phases, has to be really stretched and like extra attention to detail in the planning phase, because people with ADHD sort of need that extra planning support to help them with executive functions. And they may need a deeper dive into sort of like barriers to following through as a part of that planning phase support. But I also advocate for MI as a communication style, working with people with ADHD generally, because the reflective listening aspect of MI, and specifically the reflective listening aspect that asks people to make complex reflections, which is essentially offering reflections back that have organize the person's thoughts for them, is a really helpful for a person with ADHD in the therapy room who needs help staying on task and keeping a clear line of thinking going. And for you to take their material and their content and reflect it back to them in a way that they can hear their own thoughts a little bit more clearly and organized, I think also helps with the efficiency of therapy and like the strength of the cognitive aspect of like self-awareness building that is happening in therapy for people with ADHD. So I do think, I give a whole day talk on the question that you just asked, but I think those are some of the key points.
Thanks, Maggie.